guard my feet while I run this race. Guard my feet while I run this race.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Cross Paths tonight. Welcome to our third session of the Be the Bridge 101 study. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Abelsen, and I'm the director of, I can't remember right now because I just drew a blank. So I work here. Anyway, more importantly, I'm here with my good friend, José Antonio Machado, who's here to help me in this discussion on white privilege this evening. And we met back in 2006.
2006.
And you have been a mentor and friend of mine for 14 years. He brought me into the global mission unit of the ELCA, and the rest is history. We've been laughing, doing music together ever since. And it's really been an honor to know you all these years.
You're my brother.
Yeah, it's been cool. So thank you for being here tonight. We're going to have a conversation, and we are going to be serious. So the topic is white privilege and recognizing white privilege. And I thought I would start just because it can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around, sharing my first experience when I was first kind of hit with the gut punch of that. And it actually happened on one of our first travels together, when we would fly to various locations, and we were checking into a hotel room. And I got there first before other members of our team arrived. And I had misplaced my wallet. And of course, I was supposed to show my ID and my credit card, and I'm fumbling through things. And the guy behind the desk said, "You know what, sir, go ahead up to your room, and we'll figure it out." And so I was able to go up to my room and have a nap before dinner and check in, and came down later and saw our friend Omar. Omar Mixco is our friend from Honduras. And he was sitting in the lobby with his luggage, and I greeted him and found out he had the exact same issue. Didn't have his wallet or ID, and the person checking in did not give him the same courtesy that I was allowed to check into the hotel room. And I remember that evening for all of us, it was a huge gut punch. And for me, to kind of understand in a real big way my own white privilege. And yeah, it affected the whole night, and I think we all were pretty upset by that. But anyway, I think people want to hear from you. And again, thanks for being here. But I think it's fair to say that the Lutheran Church is a pretty white church. And I think we'd love to hear about how you got started in the Lutheran Church as a Puerto Rican, and what your experience has been, and talk a little bit to us about your experience and how that has to do with white privilege.
Well, I begin by thanking everyone for taking time to listen. And yes, I'm one of the few Lutheran pastors that does not have a name like Anderson, Olson, Svensson, but that's okay. Experience is what I'm going to share with you today, because for many who are part of the norm, lenses will not alert you like they alerted Mark when he encountered a person of color attempting to check into a hotel room. And in our church, many don't know that the most segregated hour in the United States is probably Sunday morning, and especially in the ELCA. Few, if any, people of color are usually in the pews, but then because it's so normal, many white members never acknowledge the lack of diversity because this is just the way it is. In fact, the whole story started when I was asked to go to Luther Northwestern Seminary at that time and be the only Puerto Rican on campus. And when I arrived, I was asked first thing, why are you here? Aren't most Spanish speakers or all Spanish speakers Catholic? Which meant, is there really space? And why am I being ordained in the Lutheran Church? Because the absence of Hispanics wasn't a question to be asked. It's just because they probably don't want to be here. And then I checked into Luther with my conga drums. I sing. People who don't know, I play the drums. I love to dance. And when I entered in with the conga drums, the greeter asked me what I was doing with those drums. And I say, oh, I use them all the time. I use them when we gather, when we get together in churches. And then he said, we don't use that in the Lutheran Church. We use the organ to sing. And those drums are considered like jungle music. And it really threw me off. And then that first year, because I would play in the dorms, and I remember probably drove some people crazy that I would play the congas, people started calling me Bongo Boy, which, you know, again, I have a sense of humor. That's why I think that we have to laugh at the human parade during these conversations. But very few of the courses spoke about the experience of people of color. Very few courses spoke about the Latino experience. It was as if my reality was separate from the church's reality. Mm-hmm. And it was very painful for me because the only way that I could address issues and questions that I had was to have independent studies and seek that sort of knowledge, because most of what was taught for a predominantly white audience without thinking who's missing. Mm.
So I think the groups were asked to read as a part of their study tonight an article by Peggy McIntosh mm-hmm. called The Invisible Knapsack. Mm-hmm. She describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, which is interesting. And I think one of the hard things sometimes for people is, you know, they say, well, I'm not privileged. I've never had anything handed to me. You know, so a lot of people maybe don't even believe that there's maybe such a thing as white privilege. She lists in her article sort of these things that in her daily life that she doesn't even have to think about. You know, she can walk into a store and everything, you know, whether it's products, food of her culture, music, it's all there for her. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that and the differences there for a person of color.
Person of color, yeah. Well, I've served for 32 years. And what I can say to all of you is that most members of the Christian Church or the ELCA or Mount Calvary will consider themselves good people. Good people who work hard, good people perhaps who have earned and worked their way through college, good people that raise children and bring them to Sunday school, good people that pay their taxes, good people that vote. And so the whole idea of white privilege and racism doesn't come to mind because the norm always shows you that there's nothing wrong with systems here because I do okay and I'm not really a bad person. But belonging is part of what's missing with people of color when you say to yourself, unearned. Why do you earn it or not earn it? Because as a person of color, belonging is so important. As a white person, you walk out of your house and you feel you belong. Mm-hmm. You belong when you visit your doctor. You belong when you see the president's face. You belong when you go to church. You belong when you go shopping. You belong because it all surrounds you. It's normal. So to think about what is referred to as unearned is probably a conversation that very few white people have, because the white church, white people seldom have to speak about race. Mm-hmm. Because it's not something that comes to mind when the norm, because you're good, is created for you to thrive. So whenever I'm asked that question, I go back to the fact that being white gives you a privilege. an unearned privilege that says, if you're white, you belong.
Talk a little bit about, as a pastor in this church, ways that you've had to adapt, change how you are, who you are to fit in.
Well, I definitely had to tone it down.
I can't imagine that.
By toning it down, I mean cultures that move, cultures that integrate their bodies more, cultures that are expressive, cultures that may be more spontaneous, cultures that don't have their life run by the clock. I've needed to adjust because being born in Puerto Rico, sand, palm trees, and here, what is it called, the chosen frozen? But just the whole idea that I went to seminary in order to legitimize in some way and be ordained because I was learning the white way of being. And if I learned the white way of being, then it would be the right way of being.
You just commented you knew you were in a white church because we were using notes.
We were using notes.
Yes. Okay.
You know, we're using notes. In other words, it's interesting because when you're in an all-white environment like that, as a pastor of color and as someone who is serving, it's really difficult to spend your whole life watching it, making sure that you fit in, being careful, because if you don't fit in, you're out. Even the whole process of being ordained was a little tough for me because of questions that were asked, the context, and at the end, it's interesting because one of the people in the room said, well, he's going to be serving Spanish-speaking communities anyway. And that was an interesting comment. So, and maybe that's how I was ordained. I don't know. I don't know. But there's a big difference. In fact, I've served the church for over 30 years. Most of it, first Puerto Rico, then as a pastor developer, Todos los Santos, then El Milagro. It was all Spanish speaking until 10 years ago when I was called to All Saints Lutheran Church in Minnetonka. And I was called and there was a lot of excitement. And when I was installed as the pastor, the buzz in the congregation was, are we going to start Hispanic ministry? Which blew me away. Which says loads about, even when we speak about white privilege, can we even accept what a person of color brings to the table?
Explain to people why. Explain to people more about that statement.
Well, in the Lutheran Church, there's still this whole idea that in order to serve a white congregation, you need to be white. And for the women out there who weren't ordained until, what was it, 1970, I think you can understand how it feels because now we have women bishops. But as a pastor of color, educated at Luther Seminary, and with the capacity to do anything a white pastor does, many do not see a person of color as their lead pastor, which says a lot about what do we validate or not validate. It's that whole idea that if you're white, it's okay. If you're dark, then there's some suspicion. And it's not only in church. White privilege extends itself to real estate. Where do you buy? Extends itself to schools. Extends itself to all areas of life, which is not predominantly white. And usually never ever thinking of why the leadership of color is not integrating with the brothers and sisters that are white.
What are some ways that congregations can open themselves up to be more aware of how they present themselves, to kind of work against sort of the dominant culture of white privilege that is there? I mean, it's a difficult thing.
we're doing it now. See, because all of us are a piece of the whole. All of us in our hearts have that wisdom and that teaching of what we know we can participate in and do. I believe that the lens, however, of the norm of white privilege is not visited often enough, because that's just the way it is. So the first thing is to continue to always ask good questions and feel comfortable, not because it's going to shame you, because I don't want any white person to feel guilty or shamed. It's not something that you woke up with and you said, oh, I'm going to be a racist. Oh, I'm going to really thrive on my white privilege. It's been established since the beginning. I mean, our Constitution, 3/5 is what we considered Black people. When the European arrived here, you know very well how Native people were looked at and how that land and the people were disenfranchised. The Mexican land west of the Mississippi, maybe, the slaves in this nation. In other words, to just ask questions. And I often say to my children, perhaps we have to rewrite the history of the United States, the history of institutional racism that has been part of the fabric of this country from the beginning. And now we're seeing it in church. Now we're seeing it through the viral assassination, maybe, of George Floyd. So that's what's sort of like moving us to make a difference. And I hope that more than anything is to continue to do our best to walk the walk that says, love God and love your neighbor, do this and you shall live. I mean, that's the core of this whole thing. And sometimes in church, we separate ourselves from everyday life. In other words, the comfort of that hour or the comfort of this building allows us not to continue to ask these questions that bring us together. And
Build bridges.
yeah. And to always, I want to say something out there. The joy of laughter and dance and music is so important to incorporate in these conversations. This is not meant for all of us to be walking around with droopy shoulders and pointing fingers, but rather a wake-up call that allows the lens, the narrative that we've received for so many years to be adjusted a little bit, so that more people could be at the table, so that more people could be here, and enjoy each other, for who we are.
Well, man, I'm honored to know you, and
I sometimes cry, man.
hey,
and you know why? When you can do what people say you can't do, when a brother, when black, white, all of us, there's nothing we can't do. But the whole thing is encouragement.
Yeah.
And not shaming, but encouragement to speak truth as you see it.
Yeah. I love you. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap up. I hope everybody has a great session, unless there's any questions. Thank you for being here, Pastor José Antonio.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.